Hello and welcome to the Chimera Festival Climate Fiction panel. I'm Lauren James. I'm a science fiction author and I am the founder of the Climate Fiction Writers League, a group of over 100 authors working together to raise awareness of climate change and encourage action at the individual, corporate and government levels. We are trying to work to bring about awareness of climate change and the looming threat of the climate crisis through our fiction. So today we're going to be talking a bit about some of the ecological catastrophes that have been represented in fiction by a group of amazing authors from around the world and reveal what it means to be human in the 21st century. I think this is especially important to talk about this week as the World Meteorological Organization have warned that there's a 40% chance that at least one of the next 5 years will push the temperature past the limit the Paris Climate Agreement are trying to prevent. They've said that increasing temperatures mean more melting ice, higher sea levels, more heat waves and other extreme weather, and greater impacts on food security, health, the environment, and sustainable development. So I think we can all agree that this is a topic that is worth discussing, that is only getting more urgent. So to start with, I thought I'd pass over to my amazing authors to introduce themselves. Mary, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. My name's Mary Woodbury. I write fiction under the name Clara Hume. My novels so far are Back to the Garden and Birdsong, a novella. I also run dragonfly.eco, which is a big website all about eco-fiction overall, which climate fiction is a part of that. It's a little broader, but one of my concerns has been how to depict our ecological crises in fiction. I live in Nova Scotia with my husband and 2 cats, and I think that's it for me for now.
Brilliant. I'm a big fan of your website, Dragonfly Eco, and Mary works with the League on our social media. So I'm very excited to have this talk via Zoom in person. As I think we should probably say where we're all based. I am in the UK, so there's a big global range to our locations. So Bijal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much for inviting me, Lauren. My name is Bijal Vachharajani. Yes, that's a tongue twister of a name. I live in Bangalore in India, and I write about climate for children. My books include a cloud called Bhura, which is a climate adventure. And I've written picture books on climate change. One of them is called PS, What's Up with the Climate? And I have a nonfiction book on environment. It's called So You Want to Know About the Environment. So apart from having books that have lots of questions in the titles and in the stories, I also am a senior editor at Pratham Books, where I get to edit picture books for a living. And now I'm a certified climate warrior.
And James, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Look, before I do, I should say I'm in Sydney today. I'm on lands, traditional lands of the Eora people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present before we begin. So my name is James Bradley. I am an Australian writer. I have written, I don't remember how many novels I've written, and several, a number. My 2 most recent books are Clade and Ghost Species, and they both deal pretty directly with questions of climate crisis and a series of questions around that. I write a lot of non-fiction as well. So I write a lot of, I guess what's broadly nature writing, writing that's engaged in different ways with questions of climate crisis and environmental crisis, and a lot of non-fiction about animals and things like that as well. So I work quite kind of broadly across that space.
Awesome. And as I said, I'm Lauren James. I write young adult science fiction, usually kind of speculative stuff about space travel or extinction. And my latest 2 books are both climate fiction books, because I decided that this year I had developed my skills as a writer enough that I really needed to address some serious issues. So one is called The Deep Sea Duke, which is about kind of a sci-fi fantasy set on another planet about an aquatic world where they're taking in refugees from another planet which is facing a climate crisis. crisis, and they have to try and adapt the environment to fit the new alien species. And then in September, I have a book, Green Rising, coming out, which is a thriller about a group of teenagers who develop the power to grow plants from their hands, and they use this to rewild the planet and kind of take some action and civil disobedience against the corporate entities which are kind of ruining the planet. So it's a bit of a heist and a thriller, and it encourages and inspires youth activism. So to start with, I thought we could talk a bit about some of the challenges that come along with writing climate change, because I know for me, when I went into writing my climate books, I came in with a lot of anger and emotion, and then suddenly realized that it was going to be a really difficult topic to research, and it was kind of something that was going to be a lot harder to tackle than I thought. And I wondered if you all felt the same, whether is it even possible for humans to comprehend the scale and immensity of the dangers of the climate crisis? And how do you go about compressing something so scary down into a book? Mary, would you like to start?
Sure. I was just looking up a kind of a definition for hyperobject, which Timothy Morton writes about quite a bit. It's an object or event whose dimensions in space and time are massive in relation to human life. So I think of climate change or global warming as a hyperobject, and I think when we write about it in fiction, in nonfiction, one way to get across is to make that hyperobject manageable, because it's huge and it's hard to grasp, and make it manageable for both the reader and the writer. So I think that's maybe ends up as a small portion of the climate change pie, but it can be expanded to include human relationships and how humanity is connecting with that. An analogy is that love might also be a hyperobject, but it's represented well in fiction by zooming in on it, such as a romantic story between two people. Any story that reaches the heart really can be pretty effective and impactful, I think.
Should we?
Great. Does anyone else want to add on to that? So what did you find quite difficult about writing about climate change, and what challenges did you have to face as you did it?
Sure. I can go next.
Yes, James.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it is a really challenging thing to write about, and for lots of the reasons Mary just talked about. It's big. There's that kind of sense that that kind of climate crisis is kind of borderless and, you know, massively extended and touches everything. I think one of the things that's really interesting over the last kind of 10 or 15 years is watching, I guess, writers develop various kinds of vocabularies and techniques and kind of strategies to talk about those things. And I think that's been really, really interesting. Some of them are kind of ways of structuring stories. Some of them are ways of kind of approaching it and kind of getting at it. But I think the other thing that I think is worth saying is that the longer this goes on, the more it's just part of the fabric of our lives. So kind of every book is a climate book. You know, every book is, you know, is either engaged with this, or by not engaging with it, engage with a kind of denial of it, if that makes sense. I mean, any kind of fiction that's not kind of talking about it in some way, that's set in the present, is engaged in that kind of act of erasure. So there is a sense that it's kind of just everywhere in the fiction now. And that's so it's both that it's become kind of subject and frame for the way we write, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm always surprised when I read science fiction, particularly that doesn't include reference to the climate crisis, because it feels such a big thing in the forefront of my mind that I don't know how you could not address it. Bijal, did you want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to add that I personally struggled with it when I was writing my middle grade fiction, because I didn't know how to end it. Because how to end climate change? There's no magic wand, because this did not have any magic except for children's power, which is magical, but of a different sort. And you can't, you know, anything that is implemented is so long reaching in terms of policies, in terms of actual method, adaptation or mitigation methods. So I sat on my book for 6 years because I didn't have an end. And I just kept going back to it and saying, but how will I end climate change? And I think that's one of the daunting things. Like, how do you envision a world where this is manageable, even in fiction? I struggle with that constantly because it's just so huge and it's so tangible now. From being an intangible phenomenon, suddenly it's so tangible. It's being talked about, and yet we're constantly grappling with the lexicon, whether it's written, whether it's visual. How do we depict it and how do we end it? That was a big struggle for me.
There's also an issue, isn't there, which is if you're writing anything that's kind of set at present, is that the situation is moving so fast that, I mean, I know when I was writing Ghost Species, one of the things I really wanted to do was it to feel like it was kind of surfing the moment, if that makes sense. But what kept happening was, like, you're writing this book, there's kind of fires all the way through it, and I ended up editing it, at the end of 2019 in a city that was, for 3 or 4 months choked with smoke because half the country was on fire. So you had this kind of weird sense that as you're writing it, that the material is actually kind of overtaking you because the whole thing's moving so fast.
I totally agree. I found something similar when I was writing Green Rising, which I kind of set about like 10, 15 years in the future. And I was kind of extrapolating from where we are now and putting little references into what's going on. And so one of the things I remember adding in was like, okay, so I'm going to have a thing where a species of animals all starts disappearing because of climate change, and I decided on elephants. And then as I was writing it, I checked the news, and there was a thing about how all of these elephants were dying and they couldn't work out why. And then they found out that it was because rising temperatures made algae grow more, so these algae blooms were killing the elephants. So I was literally like, I cannot even write something in the future because we're already there, we're in the emergency right now. So yeah, it's really tough. So one of the things I wanted to ask was, how did you go about researching the science behind the topics? Were you just keeping track of the news that was coming out every day? Were you reading nonfiction or science articles? And did you discover anything while writing that really surprised you, that you think that more people should be aware of? Bijal, would you like to start?
Sure. Both my books actually came from the time when I was studying climate change. I was studying environment, security, and peace in Costa Rica. And I always find, because I have a background in journalism, I constantly struggle with fiction because I always want to stuff facts in, especially when it comes to climate change. And so I did a lot of research. A lot of it was from our classroom interventions where our professors were talking about real-time problems, about tree rings, about the brown cloud phenomena, all of that. And then in my fiction book, what I did was I kind of separated the two. I have a lot, like the story continues, and there are these chapter openers, which are illustrated note, almost like a Pinterest kind of pin board that is there. And that shows the world that is changing around them. So it shows that there are farmer protests happening, or somebody's frying an egg on the sidewalk because of a heat wave. So I was able to break it up into two parts in some ways, because today also I feel like children are so surrounded by media clutter. They constantly have information being bombarded at them from different angles. And so I wanted to show that. One of the things that I came across, and it's for the book that I'm working on now, which looks at grief and climate change, I came across this species called the Indian purple frog. And it's an ancient species, some 120 million years old. And it's so shy that we only discovered it in 2003 in India. And already it's endangered because forests are being cleared and it's losing its habitat. And so I'm using the purple frog as a metaphor for grief, like it's it's the protagonist's manifestation. And I just was thinking, like, what chance does this bloated purple frog have if it's just been discovered and now it's already on its way out? So that was my this is basically my research process, and one of the wow moments I had while researching my book.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to talk about this without it getting really depressing, but I think the most important thing for me as a writer is that I'm trying to have like a positive solutions based outlook in what I'm creating about climate change. So I think we all know the dangers, and it's really important to show that there is a future, and we just have to find it. So yeah, I think having those kind of moments are really useful when you're researching, and then you can decide how you want to represent the dark truth in the book in a great way. So Mary, I wondered if you could talk a bit about Dragonfly Eco, your website, and how you research for that. And I assume you read a huge quantity of climate fiction for the website, but what else do you do to make sure that you're kind of representing the situation properly?
Well, one of the things is that the website is different than what it was back in 2013. I feel like this fiction has grown and grown since then, and there's over 800 books, coming close to 900 books now in the database. When I first started the website, it was kind of just a list, but since then I've done a lot of interviews and spotlights on people who are writing. And one of the newest things that I've done is, since the last 2 or 3 years, is try to put a focus on authors around the world, because I really wasn't seeing that in the media when I was trying to find, what's new in this fiction. Um, a lot of it was based on, mostly white North American, European uh, authors. So I just took it upon myself to say, look, what are other countries and continents doing? What are their authors writing? And it's been a learning experience for me, because I've learned about so much other fiction that I wasn't finding in my own research, just by, trying to focus on other countries and trying to follow people on Twitter and Facebook that, such as Brittle Paper, African-based writers, and that kind of thing. So yeah, that kind of goes into a different question later about having a worldwide perspective. But I think it's really important, because if we focus on writers writing around the world, then we give dignity to that place, but we also find a lot of commonalities in how we're all dealing with global warming.
I totally agree. And I think that's why it's so important to make sure, when I was discussing this panel with Chimera, that we wanted to make sure that it was kind of a global conversation, because you can't talk about this from the perspective of just people in the UK, even though this is a UK festival. So James, how do you go about keeping up to date with the climate discussions and conversation going on?
How do I do my research? Look, I have a fairly casual attitude to research for fiction. I mean, look, because I write quite a lot in the space, I tend to be reasonably across the science. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I've written a lot. I have a reasonable grasp of it. And that's kind of useful, I think, as a kind of, framing device. But it seems to me that when you're writing fiction, the question is not really whether it's factually accurate or not. What matters is that it feels plausible. But the other thing I would, so in Ghost Species, for instance, there's a sequence where, like there's a kind of catastrophic ice sheet destabilization, and seas come up, several meters quite fast, and which is not going to happen. Do you know what I mean? It's not going to happen that fast, but it kind of makes sense in the context of the book, and so I kind of went with that. But the thing, it seems to me, is that one of the things that it's really difficult for people to get their head around with climate change is the increasing kind of multivectorality of it. So that sense that you have these kind of escalating and accelerating and intersecting crises happening all at once. So I mean, in Australia, kind of, 18 months ago, we had these horrific bushfires, and the bushfires end, and then there's floods, and then there's, so there's this kind of rolling catastrophe kind of going on. Then the pandemic strikes, then, so this sense that the things are all kind of sitting on top of each other. And I think that's one of the things that fiction's quite good at getting a sense of, that sense of this kind of intersecting and highly unstable situation. In a weird kind of way, I don't know that that's something you can research. I think it's something you can only kind of imagine, because one of the problems is we find it really hard to think about. We find it really hard to kind of get at it. So yeah, I mean, I do think that sense of kind of intersection and acceleration is something that fiction gets at really well, that is possibly quite difficult to get at. If you talk to people about it, it just doesn't make sense. I'm rambling.
Yeah, I agree. It's really difficult to kind of find that balance between the science and just kind of seeing what's going on in the world right now. So for me personally, I read a lot of nonfiction. I think I read about 20 or 30 nonfiction titles. So a few of my favorites that I wanted to mention were The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac, which is kind of a look at the ways we can survive the climate crisis. And I thought, having read a lot of these kind of books, this one was really succinct, and it said a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about. Also Drawdown, which is a plan for how we can reverse global warming, laid out in kind of different strategies based in different areas of science. I found that really useful to approach my writing from kind of a solution focused point of how can we fix this if we had unlimited resources and people that were willing to do it. And that's a really efficient look at that. So that's Drawdown by Paul Hawken. And I also really liked This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate by Naomi Klein, which kind of explains why we have the ability and the science to solve the climate crisis, but we haven't yet, which I think is a question that a lot of people struggle with. Like, if this is real and it is happening, why haven't we fixed it? And that answers why, which is capitalism. And I also tend to subscribe to a lot of email newsletters just to kind of get a look at how the conversation is developing as time goes on, and also hear people who are very knowledgeable talk about how they feel about the crisis. Because I don't know about you, but I found that the more I learned, the less scared I became, because I could see the solutions, whereas when I was kind of didn't know very much, I was more scared than I am now, and more depressed and worried about it. So I find it really interesting to hear from other people who are very knowledgeable about the topic, talking about their own experiences as activists. So some newsletters I wanted to recommend are the Heated newsletter and the Lights On newsletter. And I've also run the Climate Fiction Writers League, have a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks with essays and interviews with authors about their titles and upcoming releases, that does something kind of hopefully similar that makes people feel less worried about it. So something that James mentioned that I thought was really interesting was that you're not so worried about the science in your fiction. You want to make sure that it's a story first. So I wondered if the rest of you felt the same, in that you don't necessarily focus on scientific accuracy. You focus on making a resonant, readable story first and let the rest come later. Mary, did you want to start?
Sure. I agree with James about story first. Fiction writing is art, and I read a quote once by John Luther Adams, who's a composer, and he said something like, he did the song Ocean, which was beautiful, and it was meant in his, he was inspired by the ocean environment, but he said it has to be a piece of art first to really have impact, rather than a preachy sort of thing. So, however, as far as the science in my books, well, in my first book, I didn't have any data or science facts. It was all about the story. In my second novella, it's kind of mythological, magical realism. So there's nothing that really makes sense anyway. But it is, but I want to be very careful not to base a story on pseudoscience-y stuff, or, any kind of junk science or denialism. The background facts are always there for me. And for instance, in my first book, I was reading this article about how climate change would cause mosquitoes and other insects to move north. And I thought, oh, that will make some of their diseases move north. And so I wrote something about dengue, vector borne virus being moving up to, northern United States and Canada, and mutating some so that it was causing a disease. So that was kind of speculative, but
yeah, I mean, I wasn't saying that I don't think the science matters. I do think the science matters, but I also think that, like, the kind of fiction I write is not, if it's getting hotter and there's bushfires and, the sea levels are rising, it's probably right. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, in a sense, the climate stuff, I don't feel like in a sense it needs to be rigorously scientific, but I'm not sure that much fiction is rigorously scientific like that. And I also have to say, I think increasingly everything's moving so fast that, what we're finding is we're so far out on the bleeding edge of all of the predictions that, oftentimes you're underestimating where things are going to be. So, yeah.
Bijal, did you have anything to add to that?
I think absolutely in agreement, story first, whatever happens, and especially because I write for children and young adults. I think if you don't give them something that's immensely readable, children are just like, no, thank you, and never revisiting that book again. And I think I'm the same way. Like you said, Lauren, I read and research the hell out of it first. And then I put it away and I try to read all sorts of other things before I start writing my book, because I want to make sure that while I have the science in my head, I don't want to get everything too sciencey also, because sometimes science speak is so different, and when scientists say something, the way we have to deconstruct it also needs to take some time for us to figure as to what does 1 degree Celsius warming mean really, so it takes time to percolate all of that. For instance, when I studied about this brown cloud phenomenon, which was being studied by satellites across the global south, I manifested as a real brown cloud that comes and hovers on top of Mumbai, which is the city I'm from. And the way I dealt with science was to make it more social science, because today climate change is kind of constantly seen as what somebody else thinks. What does the media say? What do the politicians say? What do the what do the religious leaders say? And so I kind of wanted to bring that in. So that kind of research makes it a lot more fun, and that's where you can put in also some of the scientific inaccuracies that are bandied about, and that's always so much fun.
I agree. I think that there's as much to get from the inaccuracies and the things that people spread which aren't quite right, which can be useful in fiction, as the actual science, because that shows you what people are thinking, and then you can address that in the book. I don't know if any of you have seen the film A Knight's Tale, which is an old film with Heath Ledger in, but that's kind of the approach that I take to accuracy in my fiction, which is that I want it to be a fun story first, and if that means that it's completely inaccurate, then I will address that in edits, but the heart of the story has to be there, and the character drive and all of that has to be present. And I'm guilty of kind of overloading my books with science and then having to cut it all back because I just learned so much that I want to share. And I personally am very enthusiastic about the science. I have a science background, so it's always something that really excites me. So I tend to think that everybody feels the same way about complicated chemistry and physics. And then my editor has to kind of politely be like, this is quite boring. Please cut back on this bit.
I recommend writing non-fiction, Lauren. I recommend writing non-fiction because then you can, that's why I do a lot of it, because there's all of that stuff that and you can kind of deploy it there. It's really fun,
It definitely seems like something I would be suited for. And I've got all this knowledge in my brain now. I clearly need to do something with it. So we all write quite different genres. There's a nice mix of different kind of topics that we're addressing. And I wanted to ask whether you all see yourselves primarily as climate writers first, or whether you see yourself as a sci-fi writer or a middle grade writer. Like, where do you view yourself? And is it that your kind of journey into writing about the climate was incidental to the fact that you wanted to write, and then this was just a topic that was important to you, or did you start out writing from a point of view of, I need to raise awareness of the climate and the best way to do that is through writing fiction? Mary, do you want to start with this?
Sure. That's a good question. I remember, like, when I was growing up, I was always writing something. And when I look back now, it was always about nature and the environment. So when I wrote my novel Back to the Garden, I did go into it with the feeling that this was imperative that I get across this message about climate change. And the first draft was really boring, preachy kind of. I had to edit quite a bit. But these days, even though this is still a subject in my fiction, I try to not box myself in, because climate change and capitalism and human experience on Earth is all tied together. And so I can't take like one of those pieces of pie and call myself that writer. I just feel like a writer that looks at the world and tries to make sense of it through story, I guess.
Yeah. Bijal, what about you?
So very similarly to Mary, I actually started by writing about animals. I only wanted to talk about animals and rescues and the animals I've met in while rescuing them and all of that. And slowly, as I started researching more, I started visiting forests. I started going to urban environments like mangroves and cities and beaches. And I suddenly started connecting all the dots together and realizing I knew nothing about the environment. But that is what I wanted to keep writing about. So because I started in advocacy as like after my graduation, I've always had that bent of I need to report, I need to advocate through my writing. And now I think there's been a transition where I see myself as a children's author who writes about nature and climate, which the two are the same thing. I think you can't write without writing about the world around you. And the problem actually comes from the fact that we constantly see the climate as separate, we see nature as separate. You ask anyone to draw the environment or protect earth, you'll see this whole, this third person view about it, that we are here, earth is over here, or we are on top of earth, or we are here, the animals are there in the forests or behind a fence. And I kind of feel like that's what we need to, I want to use my fiction for, is to remind that this is our world, and everything, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the clothes we wear, everything comes from nature. And so somewhere it's got all muddled up, and it's now like this ball of wool which nobody can untangle, for me at least.
Yeah. James, what about you? Do you consider yourself primarily a climate writer?
No. Well, I mean, look, I would see myself as a writer who's been writing a lot of material in that space, because it's kind of the thing that occupies my mind at the moment. But I didn't start out doing that, and I wouldn't want to feel it was the only. I mean, it seems to me there's a series. You kind of write about what comes to you, and at the moment, this tends to be the thing that I'm concerned about. I mean, for me, I started writing about it about 12 years ago, probably. And I remember having a kind of conversation in my head where I didn't like what I was working on. I thought, well, I should do what I tell a student to do, which is to write about the thing that they're really concerned about. And I thought, well, what is the thing I'm really concerned about? And I thought, well, it's the environment. So why aren't I writing about it? And so I spent quite a long time trying to work out how you wrote about climate. Because, back in I guess 10 or 12 years ago, there wasn't very much around. Not many people were doing it. And so I spent quite a long time trying to think of ways of doing it and thinking about what were kind of techniques you could use that would work. But I also see, like I say, I write a lot of nonfiction as well. And it seems to me the fiction, I don't know. I like to think that fiction makes a difference in that kind of, making things happen kind of way. I'm not sure that it necessarily does in a direct kind of way. But I think nonfiction sometimes can, and one of the reasons I do write nonfiction is that the turnaround's much faster. You can get stuff out there much more quickly. And I think there's more chance you can actually make things happen with nonfiction. I think one of the things fiction does really powerfully is give us ways of seeing the world, give us ways of understanding things. And I think capture the kind of feeling of being in the moment. But I'm never quite sure whether that really does anything. Does that make sense? So one of the nice things about being able to write nonfiction is you feel like there's something there, there you might actually change somebody's mind. You might get them to think about it differently. You might make something happen. You might show them something they haven't seen before. So there's kind of two different things going on there for me.
Yeah, I wondered if the rest of you felt the same, which is that you have something that you want to do with your writing, and if that is the case, what is the message that you want your readers to take away from your work? And if you could recommend one action for them to take, what would it be? Bijal, would you like to start? Oh, Mary, go for it.
No, I was just going to follow up. I love James's nonfiction and essays. They're awesome and they're very impactful, even though I'm kind of in the choir, but I just wanted to point that out. But go ahead.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I'm a very pessimistic person. It goes with the tagline climate warrior because I'm constantly worrying. But I think when I'm writing, I do want to constantly have hope underscoring my writing because I think that that's what we can cling to, especially even now in the pandemic and in what we know is the climate change is the biggest crisis we are facing. What we can cling to is hope, and hope in terms of community, in terms of human spirit, in terms of nature. And to me, I constantly want to say that you just need to look outside, and in a small red-vented bulbul, in a spider spinning a web, there is constant hope and stories. And I think for me, if there's one tangible action, and I've started saying this in classrooms constantly, is that vote better. You've got to vote better because really that's the only way we're going to ensure that we have a future that's climate secure.
I totally agree that I'm trying to do something similar, which is that I want to write something uplifting because I know that personally I don't want to read depressing books about the climate. I'm already scared enough. I want to see characters who are taking that fear and turning it into hope and action because they've grown up in this time of like unprecedented existential fear, and they're angry about it, and they're angry that they're being told that it's their responsibility to reduce their climate footprint when it's really like the oil industry that is making us feel guilty about their pollution, and their kind of anti-capitalist, pro-revolution, and they're a generation that is working against the weight of the existing establishment to make changes. So that's kind of the message that I'm giving my readers, which is a big thing to try and do in one book, but hopefully that's the thing that I think would have helped me if I'd read a book like that when I was a teenager. So that's what I'm trying to do. Mary, what about you?
As far as the fear and hope, I tend to write fiction that, okay, the world might be terrible, but people get together and do good things, and that's what makes it, kind of a dystopian place, like a more positive place. And it's a lot of it to me isn't just about hope, but like courage to be inspired enough to actually do something. I had a conversation once with Cory Doctorow, who wrote Walk Away, and we talked about this subject, and he said some things that made me think a lot. He was influenced by Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell, and basically said, we have a narrative about disasters, and that when they occur, people turn on each other and attack each other and loot and pillage, which is, just kind of part and parcel with the climate crisis. Like there's that going on, and then people taking advantage of others. And he said it's a widely accepted idea and is something that appears in a lot of fiction, and is kind of a lazy trope of fiction that a breakdown in technology or a natural disaster immediately spurs a breakdown in civil order. But, and this is a quote, as Solnit shows, by examining contemporary first-person accounts from these disasters, by and large, people are incredibly good to one another in times of crisis. So I really liked the thought of that. And this is how my fiction tends to be, that when there is a crisis, even if it's like a hyper object looming overhead, that people work together to probably can't fix the climate crisis, but they can fix little things in their own world and just try to make things better overall.
Great. James, do you have any particular messages you would like your readers to take away from your work?
I think one of the things that's really hard about climate is recognizing how bad it is. And I think lots of people still just don't have their heads around how bad it is and how bad it's going to get, you know. And I think as people get there, it's really terrifying for them. You know, I mean, I'm sure all of you have watched friends and people you know when they have that moment where they just go, oh, they kind of do the sums and realize where we are. And it's profoundly confronting for people. And it seems to me that one of the things you're trying to do with fiction is, with a lot of writing in this space, is to get people to face that thing, to look at it, to kind of look at the monster and realize what's going on. But that's only a first step. Like, there's something about once you've got there, you can't throw your hands up and say it's over. What you've got to do is recognize the origins of the crisis, which are, you know, inequality, injustice, colonialism, capitalism, things like that. And then you have to say, well, what am I going to do about it? And it seems to me that kind of, I mean, we'll talk about hope, but I mean, hope's a kind of practical thing. Hope is an act of getting up every day and thinking, well, we'll just keep going. We'll try and make it better. And it seems to me that that's what you want. In a sense, that's what you want people to do. You want them to recognize the crisis, to recognize its origins, and to recognize that, you know, we need to do something about it, and we need to do it really, really fast. I mean, you know, Bijal talked about saying to people, vote. I'd say that, you know, but I'd say, look, just act, just do something. You know, just, you know, join a political party, vote, like take action. I mean, and don't fall for all of this stuff. I mean, Mary was talking about the, you know, ideas of kind of collapse and of kind of people turning on each other. Don't fall for all of that stuff. You know, don't fetishize despair. Don't, you know, decide collapse means you give up. You know, there's not an acceptable option. You know, what we do is we find a path through. And in fact, talking about the stuff that Solnit was talking about, but also you look at the kind of history of societies, most societies adapt, you know, and, you know, we are in an incredibly difficult situation, but, you know, there is a kind of path through, and the path through is actually about building a better, fairer world. So that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to feel like there's no point taking action, either because you think you've got plenty of time or because you think it's too late and the world is already ending, when really there are things that we can do to implement real change. And we aren't just bearing witness to this thing that's happening to us. We are active in our lives, and we're all kind of have these ties to different companies which could make better decisions. And I think that as people, we need to take responsibility for that and directly address, whether that's our employer, our university, our school, like anyone that we have a connection with, and ask them, what are you doing about the climate? Are you making sure that your pension funds are not invested in oil companies? Are you changing how often the beef has the canteen supplies beef? Like, all those kind of things are very small differences, but if you stand up and make a stand and say, I've got a voice and I'm going to use that to vote or write to my MP, or try and make sure that this allotment isn't turned into a car park, like, they all add up, and they're the only things we can do. But once you start doing those things, it all gets a lot less scary, because you feel like you are positively impacting the future. So go ahead, James. Yeah.
No, I've interrupted you. I was going to say, but I get really frustrated. There's a kind of doomist kind of line, and I get really frustrated with it, but both because I think it is factually wrong, but it's also that there's something about that kind of position. A friend of mine does climate social research, she does social research, and she does stuff around the climate these days. And they just did this big segmentation of kind of Australian attitudes. And what they discovered is that there's increasingly a small group of people who are absolutely convinced it's already all over and that, you know, society is doomed. What's fascinating about that group is that its social profile is almost exactly the same as the hardcore denialists. It's educated white men of a particular age. And there's something about that group being the ones saying, let's just give up, let's just let it go, which kind of tells you about where it's coming from. You know, there's something there, you know, and something there also about, you know, kind of privileged people in, you know, first world countries saying that, when in fact, most of this is going to be borne by people in other countries, you know. So yeah, if I'm rambling, I will stop.
No, that's great. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I have good news for us all, maybe. I did a survey a couple years ago that was kind of based on a workshop that I did for EcoCity. The survey was mostly about ecofiction all around, and a little bit over 100 people took part in it. 88% of them said that reading novels about climate change or, you know, ecological problems in our world really made them motivated enough to act. So if 88% of novelists felt, or, you know, readers felt like they wanted to act, whether it was like teaching or writing themselves or going into law or, you know, donating to environmental organizations, like that was such a positive thing for me. I just wanted to share that because I think it does make a difference what we do.
Yeah, seeing positive role models is the most important thing, and fiction inspires empathy. So that is going to be on a huge scale for the planet as well as just for individual characters. So we're all based in different places around the world, and I wanted to ask whether you think the conversation about climate change needs to be more internationally focused, or whether it should be kind of about local changes that you can make in your area where you vote. And what are the biggest challenges that you're personally seeing in your country? Bijal, would you like to start?
That's a big question. I think it's no longer a question of either or. We've got to be, you know, that word global. You've got to think global, act local, is just so important right now, because if you're not going to take charge of the local, then there's no way that we're going to go international, because we can look at treaties, we can look at policies, and we can look at conventions and everything, but until unless it's put to practice locally, it's really not going to happen. Our country, India, is right now, I mean, we're going through a second wave of the pandemic. It's really hitting in it. I don't think as a nation we've ever felt more heart weary as we are feeling right now. I mean, almost everyone feels grief stricken in some way or the other. And climate change, the climate crisis is making it worse. We are looking at more unpredictable weather conditions. We are looking at heat waves that are going to be so intense. And we're looking at a water crisis that is quite frightening. So, I mean, I think, and we're looking at extinction, we're looking at deforestation at a very, very frightening rate at this point of time. So for us, I think we need this urgently. We need more local action. We need more policies that stick to the green promises that we made. We need to see a switch to cleaner fuels, because to green energy. It's just such a long list, and it kind of just, I feel like this can just go on and on. But yeah, I do think that right now it has to be a combination of both for anything to, for India to be resilient and make its population less vulnerable to this crisis.
James, what about you?
I looked at the story of climate stuff in Australia as a sorry one. We're one of the the globe's criminals. We look. One of the things to understand about Australia is that it's essentially a kind of extractive economy. So like it depends on kind of mining and quite a big knowledge economy here, but mining is a very significant part of the economy. And I mean, what you see in Australia is quite a clear case of kind of state capture. So kind of every level of government is kind of owned by the fossil fuel industry in one way or another. And what that has meant is that there's been massive resistance to kind of action on climate change in Australia. And it's kind of intensified over the last few years at a federal level by the fact that a number of the seats that end up deciding elections are coal seats or are mining seats. So you end up with this quite difficult kind of situation. And what that's meant is that, our government just committed $600 million to opening a gas-fired power plant, which every expert in the country, including our own energy commission, says we don't need. Because why? Because that's what they do. But I mean, that kind of distortion of our policy by the fossil fuel industry has been really, really, really massive. The thing that is interesting here is that what you're beginning to see is the government become more and more isolated, the federal government, as the state governments move around it, as business moves around it, as the kind of community moves around it. So there's a kind of question, like in a sense, the position is clearly unsustainable. The market forces are going to mean that we're going to have to start changing quite quickly. So I mean, it's a very, climate stuff is a sorry story in Australia, and then it's particularly bad because we are one of the countries that is worst affected by climate crisis. I mean, we have massive problems with bushfire, with drought, with flood. The Great Barrier Reef is dying. It's a catastrophe here. And you have this kind of bizarre spectacle of a government which is, deeply in support of the gas, talking about a gas-led recovery out of COVID, which is still committed to coal mining, which is saying coal will go on into the future while half the country's on fire. I mean, it's utterly bizarre.
Yeah. Mary, what about you?
Well, I think the conversation definitely has to be both local and international. As far as Canada goes, I had the awesome opportunity to live on the West Coast, and now I'm on the East Coast just for a little over a year. But Canada's also an extractive economy, and we have several issues with, there's, the pipelines are actually, it's a kind of oil that's called dilbit, that they have to use a lot of fresh water and other hydrocarbons to actually mine out of the ground. It's just a disastrous process, and then it gets piped around and to the United States and parts of Canada. We also have deforestation. On the West Coast, it's just beautiful old growth rainforest that still people are trying to protect because I think it's getting better, but we're just not where we need to be, I don't think. And another thing is it's really hard on, I think the Native communities here have had a not fair shake on this whole thing. I know here in Nova Scotia, I'm learning more and more about what's going on here. And we have a gold mine that's putting its, waste into water that people rely on. The native fisheries are trying very hard to get their rights, and it's very hard for them to do so. Like they're supposed to be able to earn a moderate livelihood by fishing, and it's just like not happening right now. But all in all, I kind of hope that we're heading in the right direction, but Canada's not exactly there yet. It's just one of the top countries that's not meeting its climate goals.
I just want to add, Mary, I completely agree with you. I think we can't even start talking about climate until we discuss climate justice for everybody. And you brought up something so important there. So yes, absolutely, climate justice for all is perhaps something that needs to be very much on the table everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That leads really nicely into the next question, which is what I wanted to ask, what you want to see more of in fiction and non-fiction about climate change. And I know for me that climate justice and kind of representation of what's going on outside of the US and the UK is a big, really important thing that I would like to see more on. Is there anything else, or do you want to add on to that about what you'd like to see more?
Because I edit books, I definitely want to add that I want to see more own voices talking about climate change, about the impacts, about the hopes, the aspiration, and the voices, like just amplification of voices, taking more charge. And what I'm hoping, and I mean, I guess this is an utopian dream, is that every book today needs to be about, every story is part of climate stories now. I think we can't separate that in some ways from reality. Even if you're sitting in your home in a lockdown, it is being escalated by climate change. So I think that, and for me, representation at with diverse communities telling their own stories, and that for me is when I feel like is something I really want to see more in books.
And
more writing by
go for it, James. Carry on.
I was going to say more writing by Indigenous writers is something I'd like to see more of, and in a sense, books which move away from what seems to me to be a fairly normative kind of bourgeois, experience in developed countries. I mean, I read actually a really good book recently by a writer called Sim Kern, who's a trans writer in the States, and it's just a short novel about a climate disaster. It's terrific, and because it's kind of situated within that trans experience, I remember having this moment where I went, I haven't read this before. This is really significant. I hadn't really thought about the way, those kinds of violence, those kinds of disadvantage kind of intersect with questions of climate advantage. I've thought a lot about, the way kind of questions to do with kind of wealth and race and things like that had, but I really hadn't thought about that. So, I mean, you were talking about own voices before, Bijal, but that was a really powerful experience for me, suddenly realizing here's something I haven't read, so yeah, it's a good book actually, by the way. I recommend it. It's called Depart, I think. I liked it a lot.
I know that when I was setting up the Climate Fiction Writers League, one of the things I really wanted to do was create a database of lots of books that were writing about climate change that might not necessarily come up, because when I was researching my own writing, I'd kind of Google for climate fiction and the same titles would come up and there would be kind of just them in a list in the New York Times or something, but there wasn't any kind of large database where you could see different genres and stuff. And Mary, I know that you've done the same thing with the Dragonflight UK website, where you've created this amazing database that people can use to look up books that might not necessarily be kind of the best sellers, but that they're really highlighting important voices. Is that something that was really important to you when you set up the website?
Yeah, it was. When I first started, there wasn't quite as many books as there are now. Like just within the past, almost 9 years, so much has changed, I think. And I am seeing a super, so many Indigenous writers now who have written novels in the past several, after I started the website, but even before, but it just takes, really trying to look for that kind of stuff to find it. And I think because of Black Lives Matter happening, it's been around for ages, but with the most recent things last summer, was it? I think people are paying more attention to writers who traditionally have been marginalized since that time, which is good. One of the questions that you had asked about wanting to see what we want to see more in fiction is I'd really love to see a very well-made movie about climate change. There's tons of awesome novels out there right now, but I haven't seen too many good movies about that have that as a major theme. And I just would love to see something that's like, credible and not just science fiction or superhero-y, but maybe something more literary. Like, I think sometimes visualizations can have quite an impact on us.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would really love that as well. So I wanted to ask if any of you had any other recommendations for books you'd like to share. I know, James, you just mentioned To Part, which I've been working with Sim on an essay for the newsletter. And that's a great book. But has anyone else got anything they've read recently that they would like to recommend?
I love weird fiction. And everybody who knows me knows I'm kind of obsessive about it. But anyways, so there's some of them is quite ecologically oriented, like Jeff Vandermeer's novels. The Southern Reach trilogy, I guess it's not too recent right now, but it just blew my mind. Christiane Vadnace's Fauna came out earlier this year or late last year. It's kind of a collection of stories that are related to each other and just took me on a nice little journey. Venetia Welby's Dream Time isn't so much weird fiction, but it's a wonderful novel that's coming out, I believe, this September. And I would just really recommend people watching for that one.
I just want to add Nicola Penfold's, these are all children's books because I walk that line. So Nicola's Where the World Turns Wild. I just read Hannah Gould's The Last Bear, and it's got these beautiful illustrations in that. If you're looking for something for younger children, I would totally recommend Welcome by Barrow, which is about climate refugees, and Debbie Delory's The Trouble with Dragons, which uses dragons as a fantastic metaphor for humans causing climate change. And more recently, we've commissioned a book by climate journalist Vivek Bhattacharya. It's called Our Beautiful World. And he, in a picture book format, tells the history of climate change and the earth. And I think it's a very powerful book.
James, did you have any more recommendations you wanted to share? Or if you have any recommendations for non-fiction as well, that would be great.
Now I think something. Look, I was going to say, I really liked the Sim Kern book as well. I'm glad you liked it. The thing I've read recently I thought was really magnificent is Elizabeth Knox's novel, The Absolute Book, which is a fantasy novel, but ends up being a really, really interesting kind of climate novel towards the end. And I thought it's a really clever, propulsive, beautiful, strange kind of book and really worth reading. And a couple of books of poems, actually. I read a fantastic book by an American poet called Natalia Diaz. She's a First Nations writer in the States, called Post-Colonial Love Poem last year, which I thought was really fantastic. It's not kind of narrowly a climate book, but it's absolutely about kind of questions of colonialism and, kind of relationship to country and water. And it's a fascinating book. And a book by an Australian poet, a young Indigenous woman called Evelyn Araluen here in Australia, called Drop Bear, which is a fantastic book as well. Like, it's one of those books where, like, Evelyn is just unbelievably intelligent, and it kind of just comes off the page. It's this, angry, fascinating, kind of prismatic and just kind of incredibly daring kind of book. I really, really loved it, and is absolutely engaged with questions of kind of justice and, indigeneity and kind of colonialism and the way, processes of kind of decolonization and how we think that through. So it's a fantastic book. Probably quite hard to get overseas, but really worth reading.
I wanted to recommend The Stone Wheater by Octavia Cade, which is a dark near future thriller about a group of female scientists who have a secret network where they share climate information against the will of their governments, which was great. So I've had an amazing time talking to you all. And before we end, I would like to ask if you'd like to share a quote from one of your books that you hope will resonate with readers to kind of share some of the things we've been talking about in a bit of a message. Bijal, I can see you've got your book ready. Would you like to start?
All right. So this is from my book, A Cloud Called Bhura, and Bhura means brown. And this is towards the end where I don't want to give spoilers in just in case somebody ends up reading it, but the children are gathered and they're protesting for their future. And Tammy's, who's one of the protagonists of this book, and she looks straight into the camera lens and says, "They tell us we are the future. But what sort of future are they leaving for us? I don't want this future full of grime and pollution, of shortages and scarcity, of grabbing and buying more and more, of hate and disrespect, a climate crisis. They say we are a generation who wants more. Yes, we do, but a more of a better future for me, for you, and for all of us. And we have the right to demand this." And then there's a bit more, and then in the end, she says, um, "This is not the future we want to inherit. All we are asking is for someone to listen and for change. Otherwise, you take away our future, and there's no bigger crime than that."
Perfect. That was the perfect message. Yeah. Mary, did you have anything you wanted to read?
It was a quote that I started my story with, but I thought when I read that quote, I'm like, this is my story. For Birdsong, my newest novella, it started with a quote by Rob Sheffield from Love is a Mixtape, and it says, "When we die, we will turn into songs and we will hear each other and remember each other." And that was just so relevant to my novel, and I think it sums up my story pretty well. In the end, it's really all about love, forgiveness, and doing the right things for each other and our planet. And a lot of that is related to memory, story, and song, and what carries on after us.
That's really lovely. Yeah. James, what about you?
Beautiful. I've got a quick quote. Sorry, two books I should have mentioned. I should have mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which is a book I think everybody should read. And David Farrier's book, Footprints in Search of Future Fossils, is really fantastic as well. It's difficult looking for the kind of hopeful quotes in the books. I just thought I'd a really quick bit out of Clade, which is towards the end, and it's just that, whatever else happens, this is not an end, but a beginning. It's always a beginning. It just seems to me that that's something that the fiction needs to be about. Like, it needs to be about this sense that, we wake up every day and it's a new day. That's our chance to try and get past the mistakes of the past, start again.
Perfect. That was the perfect way to end the talk. So I don't know about you, but I feel really invigorated now. I'm going to go away and do some more writing and take all of these messages and try and put them in my work. Thank you all for talking to me and letting me babble on about climate fiction. It's been a lot of fun talking to you all. And thank you to Chimera Festival for hosting us.